1453 marks a conclusion to the age of medieval Europe and the beginning of the early modern age, characterized by the feudal system's decline, increased economic prosperity, and more centralized government. It was famously the year which saw Constantinople's final fall, but that wasn't the only earth-shaking event taking place in 1453. On the other side of Europe, a victorious French army marched into the city of Bordeaux and seized it, ending the final chapter in a century-long conflict between England and France, the 100 Years' War. How did this generations-long war begin? What were its famous figures, great battles and impacts on the world? Welcome to the Kings and Generals series on the 100 Years' War, beginning with the Battle of Crecy in 1346. 2021 is just starting and we've decided to spend more time this year on self-development. If you want to join us and work towards being your best self in 2021, the sponsor of this video, Blinkist, is for you. Blinkist has been incredible for our personal growth and leisure in 2020, as it allowed us to learn and improve on the go and quickly. Blinkist takes the best insights of more than 3,000 non-fiction books and condenses them into 15-minute reads or ready-to-listen podcasts. The 100 Years' War was integral in the process of building a nation-state in England and France, and if you're interested in the topic, you've got to listen to Benedict Anderson's excellent Imagined Communities, while The Lessons of History by Will Durant is a great overview of the last 5,000 years of human civilization. The best thing? You get offline access to all titles. Recently, Blinkist added full-length audiobooks. Premium subscribers get up to 65% off the regular retail price. Now they've teamed up with popular podcasters to get you to the heart of a podcast episode fast. Learn with us in 2021 by clicking the link in the description. The first 100 people to go to blinkist.com/kingsandgenerals are going to get unlimited access for 1 week to try it out. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. When William, Duke of Normandy, conquered England in 1066, his status as a vassal of France's Capetian kings gave rise to a paradoxical situation in Western Europe. The monarchs of England now held ancestral territories on the continent as a vassal of the French kings, while also being rulers of a strong realm. Sometimes they controlled even larger territories in France than their overlords, a trend which reached its zenith between 1154 and 1204, when the Angevins ruled more than half of the country. This didn't last for too long, however, as a succession of strong French kings, beginning with Philippe II Augustus, gradually conquered more territory, and by 1224, all English possessions on the continent, save for Gascony in the southwest. This narrow strip of maritime territory had grown prosperous under English rule and developed into an important source of royal income through the wine trade, often raising more in annual revenue than England itself. Gascony's population valued the connection it had with the island monarchy, and were not French as we know the French in our time. The duchy's language in the Middle Ages was a separate Gascon tongue, and its people had little to no ties with the people of northern France or its Capetian monarchy. Contemporary author Jean Froissart goes so far as to call the inhabitants the English. In 1259, King Henry III was forced to sign the Treaty of Paris, in which he renounced his claims on most continental lands, but was confirmed in his status as overlord of Gascony, but only as a vassal of the French kings, to whom he was obliged to pay homage. This is widely thought to be one of the factors which made the 100 Years' War inevitable. Despite the peace, a number of dynastic and territorial wars over the next half-century ratcheted up the tension between England and France even more, giving both sides experience in raising armies and waging war. This state of affairs probably would have continued for a long time, but on January 31st, 1328, Charles IV, the last king of the main branch of the Capetian dynasty, died without a male heir and left his kingdom in a dynastic crisis. Despite the fact that the English king, Edward III Plantagenet, was a nephew of the dead king, the French lords decided that his cousin, Philippe of Valois, which was the cadet branch of the Capetian dynasty, would inherit the throne. To justify it, they cited the ancient Salic law which prevented women from inheriting any land, a ruling which affected Edward because he was related to Charles IV through his mother Isabella. Edward at the time was young, and England was under the control of Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, so in 1329 he paid homage to Philippe VI. A year later, the now majority-age Edward and his supporters slew the despised Roger Mortimer and exiled Isabella to Norfolk, which allowed him to assume control of his kingdom. The newly minted English king marched north in 1333 and crushed France's Scottish allies at Halidon Hill, leaving David II to seek refuge in Paris at his allies' invitation, who then announced that any future talks must take Scotland's interests into account. Edward was not amused, and thereafter considered the French king, his nominal overlord, an adversary. This is probably what led England's king to grant the fugitive French count Robert d'Artois refuge in 1336. He had been found guilty of poisoning his aunt in a dispute over the inheritance of the eponymous County of Artois, condemned to death and then chased out of France. Robert arrived in London and was warmly welcomed by Edward III, who granted him an earldom, a few castles and stipends, despite the fact that Philippe VI had declared himself a foe of any who harboured the criminal. When Philippe sent a demand to Edward through the Seneschal of Aquitaine, ordering his vassal to surrender Artois, the demand was rejected and both parties began preparations for war. Since Robert was actually in England, where Philippe VI technically had no jurisdiction over Edward, rather than in French territory, the order was viewed to have no legal legitimacy, which further displayed the king-vassal paradox created by the Norman conquest of England. All of these tensions came to a head on May 24, 1337. On that day, Philippe declared that Aquitaine no longer belonged to Edward because of the many excesses, rebellious and disobedient acts committed by the King of England and against us and our Royal Majesty, in particular citing his granting of haven to Robert Artois. The king then called his feudal lords to summon to war, the so-called arrière-ban, and this is widely seen as the beginning of the 100 Years' War, despite the lack of actual declaration. Instead, it was the culmination of many growing tensions, such as the gradual centralization of government, the unworkable nature of the Plantagenets' vassal status, and other factors. The conflict began on two fronts almost immediately, as the French began raiding an under-garrisoned Gascony. While that was happening in the south, a cash-strapped Edward III crossed the Channel into Flanders, England's closest commercial partner through the lucrative wool trade, and purchased the Holy Roman Emperor Ludwig IV's allegiance, but didn't gain too much benefit from the expense. Even after being forced to sell the royal crown of England off for funds, Edward launched a campaign into France with around 12,000 troops, and eventually faced off against Philippe and his army, who outnumbered him 2-1 at Flamangerie in October. After a tense standoff, Edward retreated back into friendly territory and Philippe didn't pursue him. Though it was brief, the 1339 campaign was nightmarish for the local populations in Edward's wake. Medieval military strategy was to inflict as much carnage against hostile cities and agriculture as possible, which would weaken the enemy government, economy, and ultimately hamstring its ability to wage war. The English king had seen the effectiveness of such tactics, especially in rich and densely populated lands such as those in northern France, and so the notorious chevauchée was born. While not yet fully developed, these chevauchées were low-cost raids, using limited resources with the deliberate aim of systematically devastating and lowering the productivity of territories through which the raiders marched, all the while enriching the invader and weakening the allegiance between the conquered and their king. As the 100 Years' War progressed, the utility of this strategy was to prove itself indisposable. By the time 1340 began though, Edward's campaign had left the king even more monetarily destitute than ever, but this didn't stop him from formally proclaiming himself King of England and France in Ghent during January of that year. The situation in the Channel wasn't going in Edward's favour. Ever since 1336, English coastal towns had continuously fallen victim to seaborne raids from French attacks. While the Plantagenet king's own captains often managed to retaliate with equal rapacity, Philippe VI had the larger navy, and there was a real possibility of England being invaded. Edward III therefore returned to England 2 months after his coronation in Flanders. The fact that he owed money to prominent creditors in the area also provided adequate reason to get off the continent. After making landfall, the king raised a new tax and immediately began assembling new forces for the war. Reinforcements and ships, mainly 150 or so converted merchant vessels known as cogs, were assembled at Orwell in Suffolk, ready for the attack. When all was prepared, Edward announced against the advice of his many close officials that he was going to attack France's 200-vessel-strong armada, which was anchored in modern-day Belgium, and destroy it. In defiance of those members of his entourage who decried the apparently foolhardy naval assault, Edward III proclaimed that, "I shall cross the sea, and those who are afraid may stay at home." He set sail on June 22, 1340. 2 days later, Edward's fleet managed to trap Philippe's ships at the port of Sluys, using favourable conditions and a hail of withering arrow fire from longbows to gain control of the battle. It was a decisive and surprising English victory. 10,000 to 20,000 French were killed, and it is said that only Philip VI's jester dared to inform him of the disaster. However, Edward was undermined by resistance against his tax collection at home, and this forced him to go back to England. At this point, the 100 Years' War transformed into a proxy war when Duke John III of Brittany died in spring of 1341, igniting a succession crisis between his half-brother John of Montfort and niece Jeanne of Blois. This drew in the larger surrounding powers. England, the duchy's merchants and its peasantry, largely supported the former, while France and the higher nobility sided with the latter. As well as opening up another front against Philippe VI, Edward's geopolitical interests were served by getting involved as well. English trade, reinforcement and communication routes by sea to Aquitaine went around the coast of Brittany, and a hostile ruler in the duchy might sever those vital connections. The war was initially going France's way, until Edward sailed to Brittany with a small navy in 1342, and launched a blistering chevauchée through the enemy lands, before besieging Rennes, Nantes and Vannes. After a few months campaigning, however, papal envoys negotiated a 3-year truce, and the English king returned to his kingdom in January 1343. Pope Clement VI tried to end hostilities by mediating a peace conference at Avignon the year after, but neither side would agree to the terms put forward by the other, and the war continued unabated. 1345 saw the first major English military venture into Gascony, with several thousand men under the Earl of Derby retaking Bergerac and then defeating a French counterattack in October. This action gave Edward time to plan and amass his forces in England. He sailed from Porchester in July of 1346 and landed at the Norman town of La Hogue with a large army, much to the surprise of the local population. This new theatre of war in Normandy was virgin land heretofore untouched by the conflict, and because of that, its devastation would massively affect any taxation that the Valois king hoped to extract from it. In addition, the destruction would diminish Philippe's prestige and hopefully goad him into an ill-considered battle. Whether Edward actually planned to campaign in Normandy is a matter of debate though, with some historians even claiming that the plan was to campaign in Gascony, but was thwarted by unfavourable winds. Whatever the case, the English army rested for the night, then set off at dawn, launching a blistering chevauchée throughout the Cotentin Peninsula. Normandy's rich countryside was intentionally ruined. Mills, barns and orchards were burned, while barrels of wine were smashed or stolen. Nothing was to be left for the French. Edward III reached Caen on July 26th, but despite accepting the garrison's surrender, his army raped, plundered, torched and killed without quarter. When the 3-day sack was complete, 3,000 townspeople were dead, and the king began sending barges filled with looted riches back to his kingdom. As a wave of terrified refugees fled before him, the English king marched inland towards Paris. At the same time, Philippe VI had received word of the landing and was massing a large army near Saint-Denis. However, it wasn't ready for battle yet, and therefore couldn't intervene as Edward reached Poitiers, from where he sent raiding parties out to burn Saint-Cloud and Saint-Germain within sight of Paris's very walls. The English had shown Philippe's subjects that he couldn't protect them, and began marching north again, but now the French army began chasing them, and only narrowly missed an opportunity to pin Edward on the Somme's south bank. After he managed to cross, the now campaign-hardened army of England encamped in the forest of Crecy on August 26, 1346. Though Edward had managed to evade Philippe's larger army so far, the Valois monarch's vanguard was getting unnervingly close, so his Plantagenet foe prepared to turn and fight. After a brief reconnaissance, a plan was devised. As Philippe's host, the flower of medieval Europe slowly got closer. Edward drew up his now reduced forces on an elevated ridge between Crecy and Agincourt, which looked south into a valley, daring the French to try and knock him off it. Exact figures for army size are impossible to calculate, but Edward's was probably just over 14,000 strong, made up of 2,500 chainmail-clad men-at-arms and dismounted knights, 2,500 spearmen, and 3,250 light cavalry, known as hobelards. A further 7,000 were England's lethal archery corps, armed with longbows and armour-piercing bodkin arrows. Since the reign of Edward I, every English village had been tasked with contributing men to the National Reserve of Archers precisely for this kind of battle, and were legally obliged to train in the longbow's use each week. This force was divided into 3 groups. 2 were in front on the left and right. The former was commanded by Earls Arundel and Northampton, while they followed Edward III's son, the 16-year-old Black Prince, into battle. The King's division remained in the rear as a strategic reserve. All 3 had infantry in the centre and longbowmen on the flanks, while fronted by a series of pits, trenches and stakes to serve as a defence. Edward went in among his men, inspiring and encouraging them, so that men who were inclined to cowardice became brave, whilst also warning them not to plunder until he gave permission, as doing so would endanger the army. Morale and discipline taken care of, the king allowed his troops to break ranks so they could sit, eat and replenish their strength before battle was joined. The king himself took up command of the field on an elevated windmill near his reserve division. Philippe's strung-out French army began its approach by late afternoon, consisting of just over 30,000 troops, 12,000 mounted knights, 12,000 infantry and 6,000 crossbowmen. Since the sun was about to set, and the army was exhausted from the day's march, France's Valois king intended to heed the counsel of his outriders to encamp for the night and attack at dawn, when the soldiers would be better rested and prepared. However, a combination of chivalric pride and Philippe's lack of control created a situation where he had to attack. It was close to 6 PM by the time Valois contingents began their assault. First to advance up the ridge were the Genoese and French crossbowmen, who lacked their protective pavis shields. As they went forward, a short but incredibly intense thunderstorm soaked the battlefield, damaging the crossbows and rendering them useless. In contrast, the unhindered English longbowmen stepped forward and let loose a storm of arrows, slaying a great number of their French counterparts and setting the rest to flight. Witnessing what they had saw as detestable cowardice from their fleeing skirmishers, the Count of Alençon bellowed, "Ride down this rabble who block our advance!" At which point the first contingent of knights charged forward and unceremoniously cut down their own infantry. This pointless exertion bogged down the knightly advance and left it struggling at the base of the ridge. At this range, the longbowmen loosed with deadly precision, slaying the French and panicking their horses, the latter helped by 3 organ guns which made a clamour of noise. Though some of the heavily armoured warriors managed to reach the English line, they were hacked to pieces by Edward's dismounted knights. The first charge had been a complete disaster, but the day was not yet over. Undaunted by the initial failure, France's mounted knights continued to mount charges on the English line, putting particular pressure on the English right flank, where the young Black Prince was almost killed. Almost surrounded by the superior numbers of his enemy, the Black Prince sent for help from his father, who refused and famously stated, "Let the boy win his spurs, for I want him, please God, to have all the glory." After a while, however, the king did send 20 hand-picked knights to assist his son, who found that the Black Prince's contingent had already managed to repulse the charge and were now recovering before the enemy returned. In a subsequent attack, the blind King of Bohemia, John, ordered his knights to tie their horses to his own and led their liege into battle. This charge began well, managing to get past the archers, but they were then all cut down by the English infantry. The French unsuccessfully charged 15 times in all, each becoming more disorganized and hopeless than the last. As the battle progressed, even Philippe VI himself joined the fighting. He was injured by an arrow and had more than one horse killed under him before the battle finally calmed. Witnessing the disaster that was unfolding, one of the Valois king's vassals persuaded him to withdraw. He did so reluctantly, fleeing with what was left of his army to a nearby royal chateau and then all the way to Amiens. In the dark, the English slept on their ridge, not realizing just how much of a terrible toll they had inflicted on the French. They had lost less than 100 men, while Philippe had lost over 10,000, including 1,500 lords and knights. While Edward III's tired troops were in no position to chase Philippe, he had gained a great victory and wanted to exploit it, marching to the port of Calais after his army rested and putting it to siege. As the town slowly starved, further good news came that a Scottish invasion prompted by France had been crushed at Neville's Cross near Durham. Calais fell on August 3, 1347. It would remain in English hands until 1558. Our series on the 100 Years' War will continue in the coming weeks, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible to make without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.